Thank you for joining us this afternoon. We're here for a discussion on the state of AI in education. My name is Mike Smith. I'm a faculty member at Harvard University, and it's my great pleasure to be up here with, I think, a fantastic panel. I think you're in for a wonderful conversation today. I'll just remind you that we won't go into deep introductions here. You can read about each of our panelists and their background in the program. I will go down here and ask them to each introduce themselves briefly to begin with, so that you can associate a name with a face. And as we go down the line, I'll also asking them to at least give us their perspective on what does AI in education mean to them, at least at a 60,000-foot level, and then we'll get into a more detailed conversation. Would you like to get us started?
Thank you. First of all, thank you for inviting me. Very excited to be here. I'm Nira Mayorchik Sheleg. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Wizer, where we empower teachers to create AI worksheets and to be their own publishers. For us, AI in education means the opportunity to scale teaching and to democratize adaptive learning. Before Wizer, I've built the first Montessori school in Israel, and I did a research about teachers' cognition, which led me to Wizer. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, Stephen Butschi. I'm our Director of Education for Google Cloud. And AI, I guess since I'm from Google, I should give a Google analogy, but I think that the opportunity that AI presents in education is kind of like Google Maps, that you have an endpoint where you want to get to, but we realize there's many different ways to get there. So how can we use AI to personalize that path, whether you want the fastest path, whether you want the most scenic path, whether you want the most green or eco-friendly path. So I'm really excited about how we can use data and AI to help students learn more effectively.
Hi, everyone. Really great to be here. My name is Jagriti, and I'm the Senior Director of Product and First Employee of Kira Learning. And we are a modern, digital-first STEM learning experience-focused company. And we're starting out by building computer science and AI curriculum for all schools to give all kids the chance to learn these technologies. Our world is changing so rapidly that it's really time that all kids have the chance to learn these technologies so they can make informed decisions about themselves and about the world. I'm also currently finishing up my MBA at Stanford at the GSB. Prior to that, I worked at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory in their Artificial Intelligence group on the Mars 2020 rover. So I'm super grateful to be here with all of you and all these panelists. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Yair Shapira. I'm the founder and CEO of Amplio. But first and foremost, I'm the father of Niv, and Niv stutters, and which was a good impetus to start a company, right? So I learned very quickly that Niv is unique in many ways, but he's not unique in having special needs. Just like Niv, somewhere between 15 and 20% of all children have some special needs, and require special education, and they are faced with a personal and employment and academic and social life. Actually, the life expectancy of children with learning disabilities is 16 years shorter than the average person. 80% of people who are imprisoned have learning disabilities and have a hard time in reading. And we thought that if we can help Niv, we can help many other kids. So I started Amplio. I left my job and started Amplio, which provides a learning platform specific for special education that employs many technologies, including AI technologies. We launched it about 2 years ago. It's already serving tens of thousands of students in hundreds of school districts and many states. And grateful to be here. Thank you.
Hello, Andreas Oranje. I'm an VP of Assessment and Learning Technology, and including our AI research labs at ETS. To me, AI means sort of two things that are fairly opposing. On the one hand, to me, it's just another tool that can be used the way we have many tools. On the other hand, I think it's the potential to unlock more efficient learning, more personalized learning, and more accessible learning to a much larger audience. So it's sort of two things that are fairly opposing.
Excellent. Thank you all. So, as probably all of you here know, AI and ML have shown incredible successes in some well-defined domains. I thought maybe we could begin here by talking about some of the positive ways that our panelists here in their expertise have seen wonderful uses of AI or ML to solve educational problems, or where they might think we can find some actual real good uses of these technologies in the near future. Andreas, would you like to start?
Yeah, sure. So for the longest time, we have used AI mostly as a scoring mechanism, and it's been very effective, but also plateauing to some level and very much tied into a very narrow paradigm of evaluation. I think where the real opportunity and where we see a lot of promise and we invest a lot in and develop a lot is the unpacking of those things into actionable things that are specific to students at the right time, at the right space, when they need it. And so that is really where, whether it is recommender engines or whether it is around making sort of very compelling interactions, that's really where it is. Another space that is a little bit less developed yet, outside of fairly narrow things, is in content generation and at least as a tool to help people develop content.
Yair?
So I think the most important thing in education is to educate, right? And in general education, it usually takes the form of a curriculum or some very well-defined and scripted pathway with a lot of exercises, and maybe there are places for AI there. But we are dealing with the edges of the bell curve. Special education is the long tail of education. And the assumption so far was that what may work in general education, in cohorts, in classrooms, in classes, where you can assess different children because more or less they are alike, totally doesn't work for special education, because how can you even think of assessing a high-functioning versus a low-functioning autistic kid? How can you build a curriculum for a group of children where one has a lisp, the other one is dyslexic, and the third one has attention deficit? What does curriculum even mean for these students? How can you build practice for this student? And it's clear to all of us that learning requires intensive practice. To build a single skill, you need 10,000 repetitions. And today, students in speech language therapy, for example, receive an opportunity for 10, 20 repetitions per week. So we're not surprised that it doesn't move the needle, right? You need extreme repetitions. And this is the place where AI can serve as an extension of the pathologist, the interventionist, the educator, by providing those repetitive things that are actually very strong when they provide feedback. Because in order to rewire the brain, and special education is about rewiring the brain, it's about making things automatic, you need practice with feedback, just like you learn to ride the bicycle. This is where AI really excels. And the other question that you may ask where you require AI is, what's the right learning path for each and every student? So again, a curriculum is like the turnpike. It's like the interstate, right? But different kids have different pathways, especially in special education. And this is where AI can play a role. Today, we're providing AI as part of the practice cycle so that we are able to show that you can get 10 and 20 times more practice with the same efforts. And we have about 20 million data points, and we are already starting to see emerging pathways for specific students.
So I think one big role that education has played for me, and I would like it to play for others as well, is to build self-esteem and confidence and motivation to want to do more. And that's where I think teachers play a huge role, and where AI can help support teachers as well, is to give feedback to help sustain that motivation. I think what we see a lot is if students come across a question that they don't know the answer to, then it's very easy to give up. I think that's a very human reaction. And there's actually been some really great work done by certain faculty members at Stanford. So there was an intro coding course that was called Code in Place. It was developed during the pandemic, and it reached thousands and thousands of students, and there were just not enough TA. They still had hundreds of TAs and teachers, but still not enough to give very detailed feedback to each and every student. And so they used an AI technique called meta learning, and that worked super, super well. It got great ratings from students and gave really detailed feedback, and it motivated students to keep learning and finish the course. And what was really cool about this technique is that it actually didn't need a ton of data, which is, in my opinion, I think that's one challenge with using AI in education. It's hard to get a lot of really good, high quality and high quantity data. So it didn't need a ton of data, but it was very clearly labeled data. And so then on a high level, this technique, meta learning, was able to use that small set of very clearly labeled data and extrapolate from it to give feedback on questions that the training model had never seen before. So I think it can be used to build motivation.
I think that the best way that I can describe how I've seen AI being used is through an example of an institution we were working with called Walden University. And the idea is, as they were teaching students, to understand if someone has really learned something, can they teach it back? But yet the problem is we don't have enough professors or TAs if you have a class of 500 people. And not only that, but as we think more about adult education and we think about lifelong learning, it might not be at 3 p.m. when you need that tutor. And so they built this interactive tutor called Julian. And the idea is that a student would log in and it would give content, and then it would provide short form or multiple choice answers, and you would engage with that content, and then it would give feedback based on how the user was engaging. And so it was a really great example of how AI can help scale out and complement in classroom or online learning.
There are 74 million teachers, K-12 teachers in the world. Their know-how and knowledge and crowdsourcing their knowledge is a huge untapped potential. There was a research about the 2 sigma problem by Bloom, and they found out that students that got tutoring improved by 2 division points to the 19.8 percentage. And there has been a lot of improvement in terms of personalization within AI. We see that there is another path, which is not just personalization, also the personal attention that the student is getting. Because learning is not just a cognitive activity, it's also a social activity by nature. So for the students to get the encouragement from a teacher that cares about him, gives a lot of motivation. And we think that to help teachers scale their personal attention can be a really game changer and for the education space.
Excellent, thank you. So we've already started talking about the stakeholders in this, and we can't talk about the state of AI in education without understanding the perceptions of our stakeholders with respect to what's happening with the AI technology. So maybe we could continue to talk a little bit about the teachers here. And Yair, you and I have talked a little bit about the fear that some of our teachers have about AI and it coming in and taking over some of the tasks that they feel are core to what they do as teachers. Do you want to speak a little bit about that?
Sure. So sometimes AI is confused with an autonomous car, right? That's the threat, right? It will be an autonomous teacher. Rest assured, it will not. I'll be replaced before the teachers will be replaced. That's not what AI speaks about. I think the reason that teachers and sometimes administrators are threatened by AI is because we are making a mistake in mystifying it. We don't explain it in a way, we use technical terms, we use algorithms, right? Why is it difficult to explain what AI is? Because it has an implicit algorithm, right? It's not explicit and it's not easy to explain the explicit way that AI follows some kind of a flow diagram. So we need to do a better job in explaining the explicit nature of AI. Remember that eventually when we use Facebook, we use AI. When we use Amazon, we use AI. When we use Alexa, we use AI. And we don't ask ourselves what's inside, what's under the hood, right? We see the outcome of AI when we have a personalized feed or when Alexa understands what it is that we say. So when we started approaching the market and we used terms like AI and NLP, natural language processing, and ML, machine learning, and big data, we had a lot of friction, to say the least. And then we started showing examples. How does it sound to you, a speech-language pathologist who is supposed to analyze language samples, to transcribe language samples, and then define what are the nouns and the verbs and measure the tenses and so on? How would it sound to you if this was automatic? If you can have a language sample that is created automatically? You know what, let's make it even better. What do you think about a system that fills your documentation? In special education, north of 50% of the time is spent on just satisfying the compliance monster. Is it good if we are able to fill in all the documentation for you automatically? What about if we pick up the best evidence-based program specific to a child that just entered through the door? So use cases make life much more easier and less threatening to teachers. Don't use the term AI.
Thank you. Nira, maybe you could pick up a little bit on this. You have teachers as a big part of what you do day in and day out in the producing of the content. How do you think about that tension between the production of the content from the teachers and the kinds of things that the AIs are producing that can be looked at as content in curriculum too?
Thank you. First of all, most of current algorithm today in AI, they need large content units and large data sets, and each teacher has small amount of content and data set, so they don't fit teachers today. And this is a huge loss. The potential of crowdsourcing teachers, it can be seen like the solution of Waze versus Google Maps, which both of them are needed, but they provide different things. With Waze, you get more dynamic content. For example, on Wizer, when the epidemic started, we had hundreds of worksheets created about the epidemic in a day, in 24 hours. So you get a response to current event much more quickly that way. But when, from what we see is that when decision makers are looking at user-generated content, they evaluate it based on how that aligns to standard and how that aligns to specific student needs. And that is a bit short sell, teacher-generated content, because when a teacher creates the content and they are proud of it and they give it away to their students, and better yet, if they themselves can personalize it, so the student feel that social interaction and the motivation is increased. So again, there is that social aspect, and it's like comparing apples with oranges in that aspect.
Interesting. Andreas, you've said to me before, content's still king, even in this world that we live in today. How do you see AI enhancing the production of content here? In particular, what ways are you evaluating as it becomes better through the use of AI?
Yeah, so I think there's a production side and there's a delivery side, and how it gets delivered to a student, to a learner, to a teacher, to anyone who is around that learner and supports that learner. So to pick up a little bit on your argument, what always worries me is when there's this seemingly disconnect between the core content and the sciences underneath that, and these platforms that can be very generalized. AI, artificial intelligence, is about creating intelligence, and if you keep these platforms very generalized, they're not very intelligent. And so the way that we create more smarter and more intelligent platforms is if we dive down into the content, delve down into the sciences underneath it, the learning sciences, the cognitive sciences, and create things that are compelling, specific to specific students, as opposed to some platform, again, to Jerry's point as well, that is completely black box, and I think it's unnecessary, and it creates basically bad AI. In terms of creating content, I think it goes the same way, except it's a harder process because it's a generative process. It has to be content that is compelling for this learner at the right time and for the kind of situation they're in. And so you have to, obviously there are not enough people to create enough content for all the people learning, because everybody's a learner and eventually everybody is a content creator, but not for long often. And so this idea of, again, creating intelligence, we will not replace teachers anytime. We may replace, yeah, I don't know. But the point is that it has to be supporting of teachers. It has to be helping them do some of the things that computers do better and that humans don't do as well.
Yeah. By the way, Nira, if you want to answer something to that, please feel free. But Jagriti, I want to move to you because you're taking a slightly different approach in terms of content and teachers and trying to help, as I understand it, teachers to teach content that they may not have been trained to teach, and they're finding that they need to. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, of course. So for context, Code.org came out with a really interesting report that pretty much said over half the states, I think something like 38 or 39 states in the US, they require all high schools to have a computer science course, which is great, but there just aren't teachers to teach those courses. So they're endorsing teachers from other subjects to teach them, right? And this is, and as you can imagine, without the proper training and professional development materials, this is not empowering for the teachers. This is not good for the students' learning experience either. So that's why, as Mike said, I think teacher development and teacher training is a huge part of what we're doing. Also, it's not just developing content and curriculum for students, it's developing that for teachers. And I think the way that AI can be used is actually, a lot of it is similar to how it can be used for students. So there's this, for example, what I had mentioned earlier about giving feedback to sustain motivation. Feedback for teachers is just as important, right? And this technique, it's all based on a technique kind of called data-centric AI, which is this idea of using very high quality data and not just focusing on the quantity of data. And another thing is there's this thing called the Intelligent Classroom Assistant, which was developed by some folks at, I think it was Duke University. That's also really interesting. So that kind of helps teachers understand where a student is struggling before it gets too far. Like I remember for me, I got like my first D on a math test in middle school. I was really, really sad about it. I was very lucky to have a teacher that was super, super supportive, and she helped me get through that and improve a lot, and that was great. And I think that's a huge reason why we need teachers, right? I mean, we need kind of these social relationships like we alluded to earlier to help students get through that. But if that could have been detected earlier, then maybe the teacher could have had to spend less time and things like that. So I think just helping teachers understand where they themselves and students are struggling earlier on in the pathway and which fundamental concepts they're struggling with can be really, really helpful.
Excellent. And Stephen, from your point in Google, you produce tremendous number of tools and content for teachers across so many different aspects of our field of education. Where are you seeing the greatest demand for these tools and these contents from teachers? Can you give us a little bit of that perspective?
Yeah, certainly. Before we go into that too, I was thinking about your point, Yair, about an autonomous teacher. And then to your point, it seems like AI really is a tool, just like the calculator didn't replace a math teacher, but it helped us learn more effectively in math. And I think that there's a lot of opportunity. There's a lot of fear around how AI will be implemented. But to your point on some of the trends, we're seeing as we especially work across different teams at Google to understand what students are looking for, a lot of them are especially with the enrollment declines, they're looking for real-time feedback on applications at the beginning of their process. Some of them are enrolling in some of the first places they get into just because they want that. And I think the pandemic did quite a bit to change our expectations. For example, before, you'd go to school and say, this was the technology I'm using at school. To drop a class, I know I have to go to this office, I turn in this form, I wait 2 weeks. But then when we were, in the pandemic, learning from home, and we were like, wait, why can I order some food and I can get it on an app and it's here at my door in 20 minutes, but it takes so long to do this simple process. And so we're finding, though, that AI is what's going to help us in terms of providing more of those real-time personalized experiences for students as they go through that process. And that's starting to feed into where they want to go to school. It's not just, do they have good professors, but do they have a really good whole support engagement system for me, from academic advising to signing up for classes. You want that digital first mentality, and we're seeing that they're voting that way with where they decide to go.
Stephen, if you can react, what you're saying resonates with what I heard from an administrator a couple of weeks ago, and she said that the entire school system focuses today on teaching. Let's exaggerate, it's almost about the teachers, right? It's about the curriculum is for the teachers, the classrooms are for the students, but it's the teacher. And she said about what we do, but she meant AI, lets them focus on the learning rather than the teaching, right? So it sort of democratizes learning and refocuses back on the students. Maybe a good example is, think about special education students. How long would you say it takes to meet goals for special education students? How long should it take? So you have a student who has a lisp, pulled out of core classes. How long should it take before he or she meets their goals? Any guesses? The average is 3.4 years. So they enter first grade, until fourth grade they are pulled out of core classes, stigmatized, and only on fourth grade they are back in class. Maybe it's too late to be on par with their fellow students. But if their parents are rich enough, they will send them to private practice. And the same speech pathologists will treat the same students, and it will take 4 months or 6 months, and not 3.4 years. So how come we cannot scale this to schools? And I think that what you just said is that with AI, there is a way to scale this, to scale private practice to each and every student and let them focus on the learning. And I think this is the major power of AI.
Regarding your point about focusing the learning on the learning versus the teaching, we have learned from teachers for generations. We learn from our parents. The father teaches his son, the master teaches the apprentice. This is how we've built history and culture for generations. And then we've built schools. And we moved from a one-to-one model, which is in our DNA to teach in a personalized way. We moved to a one-to-many. And this was new. And it hasn't shown a lot, many successes, and we kind of, I think, blame teachers for that failure. And for sometimes we even build technology in order to replace them in a sense. But by scaling teaching, we can enable a new model for education system. We can develop a many-to-many model. If teachers will be united, if teachers know how, like ways for education, a solution like ways, then we have actually many teachers teaching many students. So I think that there is a huge potential to focus on the teaching part. If I can ask the audience, what do you think is the closest profession to teaching? Like driver, which profession is the closest to a teacher?
Just go ahead and shout it out.
Perspective. Parenting, medicine, any other option?
Counselor was out there.
Counselor, okay. It's a con artist. If you think about it, con artist and a teacher needs to move another mind from point A to point B. So teaching is a very, very complex cognitive capability that we have in terms of perception. And Andrew, to your point, if we look at teaching as something that we need automation to take away their easy jobs, then yes, we can do a lot with it. But to replace teaching is my personal opinion is not to fully understand the complexity of this behavior.
Excellent. Terrific. Yeah, Andreas.
Yeah, so I think this highlights a inherent tension in AI and sort of the size of data. We always talk about data is the fuel for AI, big data, it can fuels, and the issue is really that it's the complexity of the outcome. So if the outcome is, did you show up for class? It's very easy to model with not a whole lot of data. If it's to try to model outcomes, it's very, like teaching and outcomes, it's extremely difficult. And the thing that makes it extra difficult is that at that level, it is inherently a very small scale endeavor, right? Classroom by classroom, the situation is completely different. And so that tension is really something where we still have a billion light years to go.
We've been slipping into the other stakeholders, the students here too, and I'd love to open it up to anyone in the panel that wants to talk about it. What are the students seeing as the role of AI and ML in their education? What makes them excited? Where are their fears in this? And then I'd love to get into the little bit of, when AI goes off the rails and we start to get into pieces of the technology not doing the right thing for us, what does that mean? But any of those questions, if someone would like to take first, please.
I'm happy to jump in. I do think, and you raise a great point, Andrea, that you have to look at what the baseline data is, because AI can be very powerful and positive, but it can also reinforce bias if you're not looking at what's feeding into it. And so Google, and actually they made it public, they looked at what are the principles that we want when we build AI of when and how we should engage. And so there's 7 out there, and making sure that the AI is responsible to humans, that humans can go in and check and see why is it telling this particular outcome? How can we verify? How can we make sure that this isn't creating a world of its own and leading us into something pretty bad? So I think that looking at that data is really important, making sure that there isn't bias in it, and then setting up your own review as you engage, try piloting with students, et cetera, and really check into what are the results of that and making sure that bias isn't creeping in.
Excellent. Others?
Yes, go ahead. Oh, thank you. Yeah, I guess I can speak. And I think this is actually related for me to the role of teachers in AI as well. So for me, thinking from a student perspective, one thing I would be afraid of is, are we going to lose teachers? I don't want that to happen. I think that feeling you get when a teacher believes in you can be so powerful to building your self-esteem, and I don't think that can be replaced with a computer or an AI. I think it can help teachers help students, and I think that's what we need to do. But that would be one of my fears as a student. So just going back to our previous discussion, I definitely don't think that should be the role of AI. I do think what it should be, I think AI can help us understand where a student is struggling, not why a student is struggling, and I think that's where teachers can also be really, really effective. To your point about, I think, outcomes and it being so complicated, there can be so many reasons why a student doesn't perform on a test, right? It's not necessarily that they didn't have enough time to study. They could have an unstable home life. They might not have enough food on the table. You don't know, and I think you need a teacher to understand why and help them move forward.
Yair, did you?
I think we are continuing to mystify AI because maybe it's part of our job. But eventually, these are very small snippets during the learning process, right? So if a student needs to pronounce the letter S and doesn't do it well, he or she can speak to a computer and the computer will give them a grade because the computer understands what the right pronunciation is. Or if the student needs to describe a scene or to read text, some AI system will transcribe what he or she is doing and will measure it versus some model and will provide some feedback. It's a snippet, it's a 1-minute snippet. What could go wrong? It will make a mistake and you said one word and it understood the other word. Do you know what's the agreement between 2 speech-language pathologists on the same recording? 60%. What's the agreement of 1 speech-language pathologist with the same recording on 2 different days? 70%. At this sense, AI is 1 more speech pathologist, 1 more dyslexia interventionist, 1 more occupational therapist. At those 2-minute snippets, at those tasks that are really high-functioning tasks, highly intelligent, the Waze and the Google Maps of education. Let's leave this to the teachers because this is what they do best.
So I think the relationship between students and AI can sort of be summarized in three adverse situations for a student. The first is they're unfairly treated. So the AI creates a situation where they're unfairly treated. The second is the AI creates boredom, and so they're not learning. And the third is the AI creates anxiety, and they're not learning either. So as long as you avoid those three, you're somewhere.
Some of the AI experience for students, it's involved automation in order to automate the process. So many of the experiences are multiple answer questions or can be seen repetitive. And sometimes they are not touching more deep learning experiences, like questions that don't have the right answer. You need to express yourself, you need to express your thoughts. And I think that for students, and I think that this is something that teachers also have trouble trusting AI, is because they need that level of engagement. They need that level of stimulation to the students. So from the perspective of the students, I think that is missing some of this aspect with AI and automation.
Yeah. So just to follow up a little bit on, is there anything that we should be keeping in mind? We've started to talk about, Andreas, you mentioned some things, but how, I always think of education, as a small world endeavor, right? We're trying to change one mind at a time and improve them as we go forward. Even though the global need for education is huge and we need the kinds of scaling that we can get from technology. But are there things that we should be doing to make sure that the really bad outcomes that we read about in the newspaper in some domains aren't happening in the education space? Is there things that you've learned in the work that you've done that would be very useful to tell the audience?
Yeah, I think Steve already touched on a bunch of these things. Make sure it's traceable, make sure it's reversible, and then do all the upfront work you can do to root out biases for the intended audiences. No system is going to be unbiased for everyone, but you can at least make sure it's unbiased enough for the specific uses that you apply it to.
And we're starting to run out of time here. Maybe we could end up just in terms of the expertise that we have here on this panel. How should school districts, if there is members of our audience here that thinking about bringing this into their school district, how would you recommend that they get started? What can they do to try to get some of the benefits of the technology that we've been talking about?
I would start with collecting data. Clean up your data and start there, and don't worry about modeling yet.
I would add, we've been thinking about it, and I heard this coming through in many of the responses of where can you automate things so that you can really triage and have your educators or your counselors or your advisors spending time on the most important things and the hardest issues. And so I would look at it from a student-centric perspective. Where is it financial aid, where if you could improve the turnaround time of financial aid applications and really make it so that the financial aid officers were spending the most time on those most complicated ones. I was just mentoring a student through New York City Public Schools trying to get FAFSA. Not easy. But I think that, or whether it's, the student experience when they get to campus on finding clubs, is there AI that you could help them in doing personalized recommendations so that they feel, especially coming back from the pandemic, more of a sense of community, because it can be feeling a little overwhelming. Or whether it's helping them find their next job as they leave, or staying in touch with them as an alumnus or alumna. So that's what I would do, is take a student-centered approach and think about where can you add some value in that, and then contact us on the stage and we'll come do some design workshops.
Any other last comments from?
I would not open the hood. I would just look at what does the application do? What's the application? What does it actually do? What are the outcomes? Do people like it? And what's the technology under the hood? You're not asking this question about 10,000 other technologies, so why ask it about AI?
I guess one thing I'll just add is also ask questions. I think the burden is on us to make sure, like you mentioned, that our tools are not a black box. We should always understand why the model is making the decision that it is. And I feel like if school districts can also understand that and it's not a mystery, that would be really, really powerful.
Last comment?
Trust your teachers and make sure that you have the teachers' buy-in. There's a lot of initiative that failed because of that.
So I hope you enjoyed our conversation today. There's a lot happening in this space. I'm sure our panelists would be happy to talk to you about more, and enjoy the rest of your summit.